As biblical stories go, which do you think is more popular in Western or American culture? The story of Noah or the story of Abraham? Let's take a vote. If you think Noah, raise your hand. If you think Abraham, raise your hand. Oh, interesting. So, in Western culture, as it were, contemporary American culture, over 24 movies, not biblical religious movies, but mainstream movies have been made about Noah. 0 about Abraham. Noah has a pretty fancy song that maybe all of you know. Let's start it together. Rise and shine and give God your glory, glory. Right? You know that song. The animals, they came on by twosies, it tells the whole story. Whether you learned it in church or in a synagogue or at day camp, you probably know that song, Rise and Shine. Abraham's got no song. If you're not from America originally, you might not know Rise and Shine, just so you know, if that sounded not so familiar to you. Now the question, not to answer or vote on, but just to think about is, which of these two people would you rather be? Noah or Abraham? Let's revisit the story first of Noah, the one that falls in this week's Torah portion. So it's 10 generations after God creates the world, and the Torah tells us that lawlessness has filled the earth as the world has become filled with bad, morally corrupt people. Fed up, God decides to flood the whole thing and essentially force a restart. But God saves one man, Noah, along with his family and 2 of every animal. Why Noah? As the text says, Noah was a righteous man in his generation. Ish tzaddik bedorotav in Hebrew. Listen carefully to that phrasing, a righteous man in his generation. Whereas first we assume that Noah was an all-around great, outstanding guy, when we listen a little more closely, we see that he may have been, a good guy, but only relative to the other people in his generation, who, as we know, were not the best people. Midrashim, ancient stories that help to answer questions otherwise unanswered in the Torah text itself, go to great lengths to emphasize just how bad the people of Noah's generation were. One particularly disturbing midrash teaches that the people of the generation were so corrupt that they only expressed compassion by means of cruelty. To quote it, when God raised the depths of the water over them, and they saw the fountains of the deep threatened to submerge them, what did they do? They took their own children and placed them into the depths, pressing them down mercilessly. Essentially, in order to ensure their own survival, one generation was willing to sacrifice the lives of the next. Pretty awful stuff. You can imagine that winning the competition for all-around good guy in that generation was not really that hard. So what about it was it that diminished Noah's status from a righteous man in any and every generation down to a righteous man only in his own? Let's think back to the story. God sees a world so overcome with evil that a decision is made to end it and then to start over with Noah and his family. God informs Noah of the plan, and Noah dutifully and faithfully constructs an ark. Noah is nothing if not obedient. Do you know that throughout the entire story, from the time God asks Noah to build the ark, to the actual flood itself, to making a rainbow, promising never to wipe out existence again, Noah never says a single word. He is literally the most silent main character in the entire Torah. He follows directions well. He's dedicated. One story even suggests that Noah never slept for the entire year the ark was afloat because he was too busy tending to the needs of everyone aboard the ship. But regarding the suffering of those around him, Noah is never concerned. He keeps his head down. He accepts the status quo. He does what he's told. Nothing more, nothing less. Noah begins the story as a righteous man, an ish tzaddik, but by the end of the story, when he comes out of the ark and life is to start again, the text changes Noah's name and instead calls him an ish ha'adamah, a man of the earth, a degraded status. Why? A 13th century midrash answers the question. It says, when Noah came out of the ark, he saw the world was completely destroyed. He began crying and called out, God, how could you have done this? Why did you destroy your world? God replied, now you ask me? And when I said to you, all flesh will end, you went inside the ark and didn't do anything to fix that generation of yours. Can you hear the lesson? We learn that righteousness here is diminished when we are not open to the suffering of those around us. But note here, the suffering in the story of those around Noah is a suffering of people with whom Noah does not connect. He sees himself as above them. He sees them as evil, as wrong. He has no empathy, not even any interest in what will happen. It goes the same for us. If we are not aware of the world around us, of people around us, of all of those who suffer, whether we can empathize with them or not, our righteousness is diminished. It's interesting to know that next week's Torah portion raises up another character that is also called righteous. But this time, he is simply called righteous. And in some ways, it places him in an eerily similar situation to Noah. This time, it's not the entire world that God wants to destroy, simply the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, since the behaviors of the inhabitants there have deteriorated to a divinely intolerable rate. When God tells Abraham of the plan, Abraham responds differently than his octa-great-grandfather Noah. That means 8 times great-grandfather. In the face of God's willingness to wipe out an entire population, Abraham doesn't accept God's decision. He stands up and argues, questions the justice of God's judgment. In complete opposition to Noah's self-interest and apathy toward the other, Abraham puts his own life on the line by engaging in disagreement with God, concerned completely in upholding justice and mercy for these sinful people. This is just one of the reasons that Abraham is righteous unconditionally, not just relative to those around him. We too are commanded to seek out this sort of justice, to bring righteousness and holiness into our world. There's no fine print disclaimer stating that the offer is only valid if we feel our actions will really make a difference. There is a reason that Noah may have been the progenitor of humanity after the flood. But Abraham is the first Jew, no less the shared root, the source for Christianity and Islam as well. To see oneself as a descendant of Noah means to be a human. There's nothing wrong with that. But to be a child of Abraham That invites a much higher calling, and one that leaves a much deeper legacy. Perhaps it's not the stuff of childhood songs or movie reel fame, but more importantly, the righteous work of partnering with God in the ongoing repair and renewal of our lives and of our world. So who would you rather be? Don't answer. Shabbat Shalom.